Okay, so let's have a go at trying to answer this question then. And I thought a good place to start, because it's a question out of a practice exam paper, I thought it's worthwhile to have a look at the first part of the question 1b in fact. And this question just asks you to show how a reduction in income tax rates, and remember, income tax is the tax that comes out of personal income, and how would, if this was decreased, how would it change real GDP? So what I've done then is to identify sort of the steps that happen that cause the changes. So you can see here that I've started with a drop in income tax. That's resulted in an increase in disposable income. That's the income that you have in your pocket. That's the income you get to spend. So after tax is taken out, that's what's left over. And of course, if income tax decreases, then that's going to increase. If you've got more money in your pocket, then you're likely to want to spend more, so consumer spending will increase. As you can see, that increases C in the aggregate demand equation. This increases aggregate demand, and the AD curve moves to the right. And also, as you can easily pinpoint, that will result in a new equilibrium further along the horizontal axis, and that of course is a growth in real output. Okay, so let's have a look at the question then. And the question asks us to compare and contrast the effects on economic growth of a reduction in interest rates compared to a reduction in income tax rates. And there's some bullet points there to address. Explain in detail how the reduction in interest rates would affect growth. Explain why interest rates may have a greater effect on growth than reduction in income tax rates. And then show the changes in the graph below. Now, before we start, just recall the comments I made at the beginning of this lesson today. Okay, comments were this compare and contrast here. Compare and contrast. What we want to try and do is to say, hey, look, what's the same about them? What's different about them? And overall, what's the impact? And that's what this question is really asking you. So let's take a look at where we can start. So a reduction in interest rates will clearly decrease the incentive to save. Lower interest rates mean you get less return on your money in the bank. Therefore, there's less incentive to save. And if this is the case, it's going to be an increased incentive to spend. Less saving, more spending. Okay, so there's one, increased incentive to spend. It will also lower the cost of borrowing, therefore increasing the incentive of firms to borrow. So the incentive to borrow increases. Lower interest rates, cheaper to borrow, therefore more incentive to borrow. It will lower demand for the New Zealand dollar as investors seek better returns elsewhere. Okay, investors seek better returns. That means overseas investors, when they notice that the interest rates in New Zealand go down, then they look elsewhere. They look to other countries. They look to Australia or America or other countries around the world to invest their money that may offer some better returns. So overall then, more borrowing from firms leads to more investment, okay, and a lower New Zealand dollar leads to cheaper and therefore more exports. So overall, what do we see? In the AD equation, C increases, investment increases because that's I, and exports increase. So three parts of the equation increase, C, I, and G, they're all increasing. So that's going to be a pretty significant impact on aggregate demand, you would think. Okay, so let's scroll down the page. Let's have a look at let's compare a drop in income tax. Well, clearly it will increase consumers' disposable income. We said that in the previous question. And it will lead to more consumer spending. Okay, so AD will increase, of course, but not to the same extent as the above interest rate effect, because it only increases C in the AD equation. You could, I've made a note just here, you could also argue that less income tax means government spending might have to decrease as a result. So that would even, that has the potential of even slowing down any effect that the increase in consumer spending would have, because government spending would go down. But that's just don't worry too much about that. That's an added extra you could put in there if you understood what it meant, but it's not absolutely essential. Okay, so what's the overall impact? Overall, both changes will move the AD curve to the right. I think everybody can see that. Now this will lead to an increase in real output. So you've got to say these words, they're pretty critical. Increase in real output and economic growth. So they both will lead to economic growth. But due to its much wider effect, the drop in interest rates would be expected to have a much greater impact on growth. A much greater impact on growth in the economy than reduced income tax. Okay, so let's just quickly go back up, have a look at the question again. So we explained in detail how a reduction in interest rates would affect economic growth. We did that. We explained in detail why a reduction in interest rates may have greater effect on economic growth than a reduction in tax rates. We did that. Now all that's left is for us to show both the changes on the graph. Let's have a look at the graph then. So there it is there. We've got situation 1, a drop in income tax, situation 2, a drop in interest rates. And I think we said this, let's try and draw it in. AD1 is going to be a relatively small shift of the AD curve. Let's put it in here. Let's call that AD1. Okay. Remember to do our arrows. 2 arrows there. And then AD2 is going to be a much more significant shift in AD. So let's call AD2 out here. And there, shift the AD curve out. That's a much bigger shift. There it is there. Okay. So it just shows you the impact of both of those. The income tax effect is going to be much less than the interest rates effect. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Cheers.